Michael Ray Dibdin Heseltine, Baron Heseltine CH PC is a British businessman, conservative politician and patron of the Tory Reform Group. He was a Member of Parliament from 1966 to 2001, and was a prominent figure in the governments of Margaret Thatcher and John Major, including serving as Deputy Prime Minister under the latter. In 1990 he stood for the leadership of the Conservative Party against Margaret Thatcher, and although he was unsuccessful in his bid, his action triggered Thatcher's eventual resignation. Heseltine entered the cabinet in 1979 as Secretary of State for the Environment, where he promoted the Right to Buy campaign that allowed 2 million families to purchase the council houses. He was Secretary of State for Defense from 1983 to 1986. In the latter role he was instrumental in the political battle against the campaign for nuclear disarmament. Heseltine was widely considered an adept media performer and a charismatic minister, although he was frequently at odds with Thatcher on economic issues and was one of the most visible wets in that regard. He resigned from the cabinet in 1986 over the Westland affair and returned to the backbenches, following Geoffrey Howe's resignation speech in November 1990. Heseltine challenged Thatcher from the leadership of the Conservative Party, polling well enough to deny her an outright victory on the first ballot. He lost to John Major on the second ballot. Major later returned Heseltine to the cabinet. As a key ally of Major, Heseltine rose to become President of the Board of Trade and, from 1995, Deputy Prime Minister and First Secretary of State. He declined to seek the leadership of the party following Major's 1997 election defeat, but remained a vocal advocate for modernization in the party. Heseltine was seen as a one nation Tory, epitomised by his support for the regeneration of the city of Liverpool, at a time when it was facing economic collapse. The subsequent transformation of Liverpool, with his support, saw Heseltine having the award of Freeman of the City of Liverpool bestowed upon him in 2012. Early life. Michael Heseltine was born in Swansea in Wales, the son of Rupert Heseltine, a factory owner, and Eileen Ray. He is a distant descendant of Charles Dibdin. His father's ancestors were farm labourers in Pembrey. His mother originated in West Wales and his maternal great-grandfather worked at the Swansea docks. His maternal grandfather, James Pridmore, founded West Glamorgan Collieries Limited, a short-lived company that briefly worked 2 small mines on the outskirts of Swansea. Heseltine was brought up in relative luxury at No. 1 Uplands Crescent. He enjoyed angling in Bryn Mill Park and won a junior competition. He was educated at Shrewsbury School. He campaigned briefly as a volunteer in the October 1951 general election before going up to Pembroke College, Oxford, where, in frustration at his inability to be elected to the committee of the Oxford University Conservative Association, he founded the breakaway Blue Ribbon Club. Julian Critchley recounts a story from his student days of how he plotted his future on the back of an envelope, a future that would culminate as Prime Minister in the 1990s. A more detailed apocryphal version has him writing down, millionaire 25, cabinet member 35, party leader 45, prime minister 55. He became a millionaire and was a member of the shadow cabinet from the age of 41 but did not manage to become party leader or prime minister. Heseltine's biographers Michael Crick and Julian Critchley recount how, despite not having an innate gift for public speaking, he became a strong orator through much practice, which included talking in front of a mirror, listening to tape recordings of speeches by television administrator Charles Hill, and taking voice coaching lessons from a vicar's wife. In the 1970s and 1980s, Heseltine's conference speech was often to be the highlight of the Conservative Party conference, despite his views being well to the left of the then leader Margaret Thatcher. He was eventually elected to the committee of the Oxford Union after 5 terms at the university. In his third year, having challenged unsuccessfully for the presidency the previous summer, he served in top place on the committee, then as secretary, and then treasurer. During this last post he reopened the union cellars for business and persuaded the visiting Sir Bernard and Lady Dockett to contribute to the considerable cost. After graduating with a second-class degree in philosophy, politics and economics, described by his own tutor as the great and undeserved triumph, he was permitted to stay on for an extra term to serve as president of the Oxford Union for Michaelmas term 1954, having been elected with the assistance of leading Oxford socialists Anthony Howard and Jeremy Isaacs. National service and business career. After graduating he built up a property business in partnership with his Oxford friend Ian Josephs. With financial support from both of their families they started with a boarding house in Clanricarde Gardens and progressed to various other properties in the Bayswater area. He trained as an accountant but after failing his accountancy exams in 1958 could no longer avoid conscription into national service. Heseltine later admitted to admiring the military as his father, who died in 1957, had been a lieutenant colonel in the Royal Engineers in the Second World War and active in the Territorial Army thereafter. Heseltine felt that his business career was too important to be disrupted, although he and his father took the precaution of arranging interviews to increase his chances of attaining an officer's commission in case he had to serve. Heseltine had been lucky not to be called up for the Korean War in the early 1950s of the Suez Crisis in 1956, but in the final years of national service, already due for abolition by 1960, an effort was made to call up men who had so far managed to postpone service. Despite having almost reached the newly reduced maximum call-up age of 26, Heseltine was conscripted in January 1959, becoming a second lieutenant in the Welsh Guards. Heseltine left the Guards to contest the general election that year. According to Ian Josephs, this had been his plan from the start, and he was exempted on business grounds from the remaining 16 months of service. During the 1980s, his habit of wearing a Guards regimental tie, sometimes incorrectly knotted with a red stripe on the neck, was the subject of much acerbic comment from military figures and from older MPs with extensive war records. Crick estimated that he must have worn the tie on more days than he actually served in the Guards. Heseltine built a housing estate at Tenterden, Kent, which failed to sell and was beset with repair problems until after his election to Parliament. Founded the magazine publishing company Haymarket in collaboration with another Oxford friend Clive Labourvidge, and early in the 1960s acquired the famous magazine Man About Town, whose title he shortened to About Town, then simply Town. In 1962 he also briefly published a well-received weekly newspaper, Topic, which ceased publication but whose journalists later became the Sunday Times inside team. Between 1960 and 1964 he also worked as a part-time interviewer for iThe. After rapid expansion, Heseltine's businesses were badly hit by the Selwyn-Lloyd credit squeeze of 1962 and, still not yet 30 years old, he would eventually owe £250,000. He claims to have been lent a badly needed £85,000 by a bank manager who retired the same day. Later, during the 1990s, Heseltine joked about how he had avoided bankruptcy by such stratagems as paying bills only when threatened with legal action, although he eventually settled all his debts. It was during this stressful period of his life that he took up gardening as a serious hobby. In 1967, Heseltine secured Haymarket's financial future by a deal with British Printing Corporation. In return for managing several of BPC's magazines, Haymarket sold a 60% stake to BPC, whilst Heseltine and other directors retained smaller shareholdings. Under the management of Lindsay Masters, the company grew, publishing a series of profitable motoring, management and advertising journals. BPC's stake was bought back in the early 1970s whilst Heseltine was serving in the Heath government. Heseltine acted as a consultant to Haymarket during his periods out of government office and resumed management of the company after Masters' retirement in 1999. Heseltine's ownership of Haymarket has made him a large personal fortune. As of 2013, he was ranked 311th in the Sunday Times Rich list with an estimated wealth of £264 million. Member of Parliament. Heseltine contested the safe Labour seat of Gower at the October 1959 general election. In 1964 he contested the marginal constituency of Coventry North, which he lost to the incumbent Labour member Maurice Edelman by 3,530 votes. Heseltine was eventually successful at the 1966 general election, becoming the Member of Parliament for the safe Conservative seat of Tavistock in Devon. After the abolition of the Tavistock constituency, he represented Henley from February 1974. Following the Conservative victory in the 1970 general election, Heseltine was promoted to the government by Prime Minister Edward Heath, serving briefly as a junior minister at the Department of Transport before moving to the Department for the Environment, where he was partly responsible for shepherding the Local Government Act 1972 through Parliament. In 1972, he moved to the Department of Industry. In 1972, Heseltine was a strong supporter of Heath, who was suffering from an open rebellion against his leadership of the Conservative Party by Enoch Powell and Ronald Bell. Heath retaliated by persuading Heseltine to oppose Bell, whose own seat was due to be abolished in the current round of boundary changes, and challenge him for the Conservative nomination for the new seat of Beaconsfield. A struggle within the local Conservative ranks ensued. Bell's campaign against Heseltine, who had Heath's backing, was masterminded by Hugh Symonds, chairman of the Young Conservatives, and Bell narrowly survived. As Minister for Aerospace in 1973, Heseltine was responsible for persuading other governments to invest in Concorde and was accused of misleading the House of Commons when he stated that the government was still considering giving financial support to the tracked hovercraft when the cabinet had already decided to withdraw funding. Although his chief critic Ery Neve disliked Heseltine as a brash, arrivist, Neve's real target, in the view of Heseltine's PPS Cecil Parkinson, was Heath, whom Neve detested and later helped to topple as party leader in 1975. Heseltine was Shadow Industries Secretary throughout the Conservatives' 1974–79 time in opposition, gaining notoriety following a 1976 incident in the House of Commons during the debate on measures introduced by the Labour government to nationalise the shipbuilding and aerospace industries. In the days before television's broadcasting of proceedings in Parliament, accounts of exactly what happened vary, but the most vivid image portrayed Heseltine seizing the mace and brandishing it towards Labour left-wingers, who were celebrating having won the vote and singing the red flag. The Speaker suspended the sitting. Heseltine subsequently acquired the nickname Tarzan and was forever thereafter caricatured as such, complete with loincloth, in the iThe series drawn by satirical political cartoonist Steve Bell. During the 1980s, this macho image was reinforced by the satirical iThe puppet show Spitting Image, which portrayed him as a camouflage-clad warrior reminiscent of the 1960s white British mercenary of the Congard Col. Mad Mike Hoare. This was after an occasion when, as Defense Secretary in Margaret Thatcher's government, he had been persuaded to wear a camouflage anorak over his suit while inspecting troops in the rain on 6 February 1985, when he deployed 1,500 police and soldiers to fence off RAF Molesworth to prevent anti-nuclear protesters from entering the cruise missile base. Member of the Cabinet, Housing. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher appointed Heseltine to the Cabinet as Secretary of State for the Environment in 1979 following her election victory. In May of that year, he was a key figure in the sale of council houses under the right to buy policy the Conservatives had promised in the election campaign. In the Housing Act 1980 and subsequent acts, he had charge of the legislation. Some 6 million people were eligible, about 1 in 3 actually purchased the home. Heseltine noted that no single piece of legislation has enabled the transfer of so much capital wealth from the state to the people. Quote, he said that the right to buy policy had 2 main objectives: to give people what they had wanted, and to reverse the trend of ever-increasing dominance of the state over the life of the individual. He said, there is in this country a deeply ingrained desire for home ownership. The government believed that this spirit should be fostered. It reflects the wishes of the people, ensures the widespread of wealth through society, encourages a personal desire to improve and modernize one's own home, enables parents to accrue wealth for their children, and stimulates the attitudes of independence and self-reliance that are the bedrock of a free society. Riots. Heseltine became the troubleshooter to deal with the explosion of violence in Britain's inner cities in the aftermath of the Brixton and Toxteth riots of 1981. As Environment Secretary, he opened Britain's first enterprise zone at Corby in Northamptonshire. Heseltine was responsible for developing the policies that led to 5 biannual National Garden festivals which began in 1984. He established development corporations that were directly appointed by the minister and overrode local authority planning controls, a controversial measure in Labour strongholds such as East London, Merseyside and North East England. Defence. Heseltine then served as Secretary of State for Defence from January 1983, his presentational skills being used to take on the campaign for nuclear disarmament in the June 1983 general election until January 1986, when he resigned in a bitter cabinet dispute with Thatcher over the Westland affair. He apparently gathered up his papers and rose from his seat proclaiming, "I can no longer be a member of this cabinet," and then marched out of the cabinet office. Within hours he issued a statement denouncing Thatcher's managerial style and suggesting she was a lie who lacked integrity. Heseltine later said that he regretted resigning from the cabinet in 1986, as he subsequently often wondered if he and Nigel Lawson might have been able to persuade Thatcher to abandon the poll tax, backbenchers and leadership contest. He returned to the backbenchers, where he became increasingly critical of Margaret Thatcher's performance, declining to support the passage of the Community Charge through Parliament in 1988. He actually voted against the government only when he supported an amendment proposed by his ally Michael Mates that would have adjusted the charge tax to take account of ability to pay. He abstained in the December 1989 Conservative Party leadership election, in which Sir Anthony Mayor challenged Thatcher for the party leadership and repeatedly insisted that he could not foresee circumstances in which he would challenge Thatcher himself from the leadership. Following Geoffrey Howe's resignation speech on 13 November 1990, Heseltine announced his candidacy for the leadership of the Conservative Party. During the subsequent leadership election on 20 November, he polled 152 votes in the first round of voting by Conservative MPs, enough to prevent an outright Thatcher victory. Heseltine was thought by many pundits to be on course to beat her in the second ballot, as many Conservative MPs were now rumoured to be ready to switch support from Thatcher, and only 27 would had to have done so to give Heseltine the overall majority he would need in the second ballot, with lukewarm support from her cabinet, most of whom had told her that she could not win, and faced with the bitter prospect of a Heseltine premiership, Thatcher withdrew from the contest and announced her resignation on the morning of the 22nd of November, although she continued to serve as Prime Minister until a new party leader had been chosen. Over the weekend on 24-25 November, many Conservative MPs were faced with the anger of the local party members who overwhelmingly supported Thatcher but did not at the time have a vote in leadership elections, and opinion polls showed that Chancellor John Major would also boost Conservative support if leader in the second ballot. A week after the first, Heseltine's vote actually fell to 131, as some MPs had voted for him in the first ballot as a protest against it to try to oust Thatcher, but preferred to vote for other candidates now that they had a wider choice. John Major, with 185 votes, was only 2 votes short of an overall majority. Heseltine immediately and publicly conceded defeat, announcing that he would vote for Major if the third ballot went ahead. Although for the rest of his career Heseltine's role in Thatcher's downfall earned him enmity from Thatcher's supporters in the Conservative Party, this opprobrium was not universal. In a reference to the reluctance of the cabinet to support Thatcher on the second ballot, Edward Lee said of Heseltine, "At least he stabbed her in the front." Return to the cabinet. Heseltine then returned to government as Secretary of State for the Environment, with particular responsibility for reviewing the community charge, widely and correctly expected to lead to the poll tax being abolished, allegedly declining an offer of the position of Home Secretary. Following the 1992 general election, he was appointed Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, choosing to be known by the title, dormant since 1974, of President of the Board of Trade, and promising to intervene before breakfast, dinner and tea to help British companies. Heseltine's responsibilities also included energy, which was previously a separate ministry. When plans were made in 1992 for the privatization of British coal, it fell to Heseltine to announce that 31 collieries were to close, including many of the mines in Nottinghamshire that had continued working during the 1984-5 strike. Although this policy was seen by the Nottinghamshire miners as a betrayal, there was hardly any organised resistance to the programme. The following week, a threatened rebellion by some Conservative MPs over the plans led to the number of closures being scaled back to the 10 least viable mines. The government stated that since the pits were losing money, they could be sustained only through unjustifiable government subsidies. Mine supporters pointed to the mines' high productivity rates and to the fact that the monetary losses were due to the large subsidies that other European nations were giving to the coal industries. While Heseltine is generally seen as a one-nation conservative, his reputation in the coalfields remains low. The band Chumbawamba released the critical song, Mr. Heseltine Meets the Public, that portrayed him as an out-of-touch figure. The same group had once dedicated a song to the village of Fitzwilliam, West Yorkshire, which was reduced to a ghost village by the closure of the local coal pits. On the 21st of June 1993, Heseltine suffered a minor heart attack while in Venice, which led to concerns about his ability to remain in government after he was shown on television leaving hospital in a wheelchair. In 1994, Chris Morris jokingly implied on BBC Radio 1 that Heseltine had died died, and persuaded MP Jerry Hayes to broadcast an on-air tribute. Morris was subsequently suspended. Heseltine, who after being seen as an arrivist in his younger days was now something of a grandee and elder statesman. In 1994 he re-emerged as a serious political player, helped by his flirting with the idea of privatizing the post office. His testimony to the Arms to Iraq inquiry in 1996 revealed that he had refused to sign the certificates attempting to withhold evidence. The cover of Private Eye announced "A Legend Lives," and one major newspaper ended an editorial by proclaiming that the balance of probability was that Heseltine would be Prime Minister before the end of the year, this being at a time when John Major's leadership had lost much credibility after the "back to basics" scandals. However, there was to be no leadership election that autumn. Deputy Prime Minister in mid-1995, John Major found himself consistently opposed by a minority of Eurosceptic MPs in his party and challenged them to put up or shut up by resubmitting himself to a leadership election in which he was unsuccessfully opposed by John Redwood, the Secretary of State for Wales. There was speculation that Heseltine's supporters would engineer Major's downfall in the hope that the man would take over, but they stayed loyal to Major. Heseltine, who showed his ballot paper to the returning officers to prove that he had voted for Major, commented that John Major deserves a great deal better than that from his colleagues. He was promoted to Deputy Prime Minister and First Secretary of State. In this capacity he chaired a number of key cabinet committees and was also an early key enthusiast for the Millennium Dome. In December 1996, Heseltine, angering Eurosceptics, joined with Conservative Chancellor Kenneth Clarke in preventing any movement away from the government's official refusal to decide on whether or not to join the single currency. Heseltine suffered further heart trouble early in 1997, and declined to stand for the Conservative Party leadership again after the 1997 general election, although there was still speculation that Clarke might have stood aside for him to stand as a compromise candidate. He became active in promoting the benefits for Britain of joining the single European currency, appearing on the same stage as Tony Blair, Gordon Brown and Robert Cook as part of an all-party campaign to promote Euro membership. He was also made a Companion of Honour in the 1997 Resignation Honours list.